In autumn 1621, Wampanoag leader Massasoit heard gunfire echoing across the Massachusetts forest. 90 of his warriors immediately mobilised, convinced the English settlement at Plymouth was under attack. But when they arrived, they found something else entirely. The colonists were shooting birds for a harvest feast. What happened next would be twisted, rewritten, and weaponised for centuries, becoming a story so divorced from reality that even the food we associate with it is mostly fiction. Here's the thing about Thanksgiving. Almost nothing you learned in elementary school actually happened. The Pilgrims never called it Thanksgiving. The Wampanoag weren't invited guests. They showed up because they thought their allies were in danger. And the harmonious feast between cultures, that was invented by tourism promoters in the 1830s trying to save Plymouth's failing economy. The real story involves a catastrophic plague that killed 45,000 indigenous people, a widowed mother of 5 who spent 30 years creating a national holiday, and Abraham Lincoln using gratitude as a weapon during America's bloodiest war. Every element of modern Thanksgiving, from the date we celebrate it to the pumpkin pie on your table, emerged from specific political calculations, not tradition. To understand what really happened in 1621, we need to start 3 years earlier, in 1618, when something apocalyptic was unfolding along the New England coast. European trading ships had been visiting these waters for decades, exchanging metal tools and wool blankets for beaver pelts and other furs, but in 1616, those ships brought something else. Disease-carrying rodents infected with what modern epidemiologists believe was leptospirosis, a bacterial infection that attacks the liver and kidneys. The Wampanoag called it the Great Dying. Within 3 years, approximately 2/3 of their nation, 45,000 people, were dead. Entire villages were wiped out. Children, elders, healers, leaders, gone. The Massachusetts people lost 90% of their population. The mainland Pokanoket were nearly extinct. Think about those numbers for a moment. Imagine if, over the next 3 years, 2 out of every 3 people you know died from a mysterious illness. Your knowledge keepers, your historians, your teachers, most of them gone. The social fabric doesn't just tear, it disintegrates. Languages begin to disappear. Ceremonial knowledge vanishes. Agricultural techniques developed over centuries are lost because the people who held that knowledge died before they could pass it on. This is the world the Mayflower sailed into on December 21st, 1620. The Pilgrims didn't discover virgin wilderness, they found a post-apocalyptic landscape. Plymouth itself was built on the bones of a Wampanoag village called Patuxet, abandoned when every single inhabitant died from the plague. The colonists found cleared fields ready for planting, fresh water sources already identified, and even stores of corn buried in the ground, which they promptly stole. Meanwhile, across the forest, Massasoit was making calculations that would determine his people's survival. The Wampanoag had been reduced from about 70,000 people to fewer than 25,000. Their traditional enemies, the Narragansett to the west, had somehow escaped the plague. They still had their full military strength. Massasoit knew that without allies, the Wampanoag would either be absorbed or annihilated by the Narragansett within a few years. Enter the English, 103 of them, including women and children, clearly struggling to survive their first winter. Half would be dead by spring. These weren't conquistadors or professional soldiers. They were religious separatists who'd spent the last 12 years living in Dutch cities, working in textile mills. They knew nothing about farming in New England soil, nothing about the 6-month winters, nothing about which plants were edible or poisonous. In March 1621, Massasoit made his move. He didn't send just anyone to make contact, he sent Tisquantum, known to history as Squanto. This choice was calculated. Tisquantum spoke fluent English, having been enslaved and taken to Europe years earlier. He'd lived in London, learned English customs, even stayed in the house of a shipbuilder. He'd returned to find his entire village, Patuxet, where Plymouth now stood, completely dead from the plague. Tisquantum became the interpreter, but more importantly he taught the colonists how to survive. The famous story about using fish to fertilise corn, that was Tisquantum showing them how to bury menhaden with corn seeds to enrich the sandy coastal soil. Without his intervention, the colony would have starved within months. By March 22, 1621, Massasoit and Plymouth Governor John Carver signed a treaty. This wasn't some feel-good cultural exchange, It was a mutual defence pact. The terms were specific. If either party was attacked, the other would provide military support. They would trade exclusively with each other. They would return any tools or goods stolen from either side. Most importantly for Massasoit, the English would help defend against the Narragansett. This treaty context is crucial because it explains what really happened at that famous 1621 feast. We only have 2 eyewitness accounts of the 1621 harvest celebration, and neither one calls it Thanksgiving. The first comes from Edward Winslow, who wrote a letter to a friend in England describing the event. The second is from William Bradford's journal, written 20 years after the fact. Between these 2 sources, we have maybe 500 words describing what actually happened. Here's Winslow's account. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruit of our labours. The hunting party returned with enough birds to feed the colony for a week. The colonists were practising military drills, firing their muskets in celebration. This is when those gunshots echoed through the forest to Massasoit's village about 40 miles away. The Wampanoag had dealt with European violence before, fishing crews who would come ashore, kidnap people for the slave trade, and sail away. When Massasoit heard sustained gunfire from Plymouth, he assumed either his allies were under attack or they were planning one. He gathered 90 warriors and marched to Plymouth. When they arrived and found a celebration instead of a battle, diplomatic protocol demanded they stay. The Wampanoag didn't come empty-handed. They brought 5 deer, which would have provided more meat than all the birds the colonists had shot. For 3 days the 2 groups ate together, but this wasn't some harmonious cultural exchange. The language barrier alone would have made real communication nearly impossible. Only Tisquantum and 1 or 2 others could translate. The Wampanoag warriors likely camped outside the settlement walls. The colonists remained armed and suspicious. Both sides were maintaining a tense military alliance, not celebrating friendship. And here's what they definitely weren't eating. No cranberry sauce, no pumpkin pie, no mashed potatoes. Potatoes hadn't even reached North America yet. They wouldn't arrive from South America for another century. The colonists had no butter, no wheat flour for bread, no oven capable of baking pies. Sugar was so expensive it might as well have been gold. What did they eat? Venison, definitely. Wild fowl, which included ducks, geese and yes, probably turkey. Corn, but not on the cob. Ground into meal and made into a kind of porridge. Squash and beans from the Wampanoag's 3 sisters' agriculture. Shellfish like mussels and lobster. Walnuts, chestnuts and dried berries. They drank water and possibly a weak beer made from barley. But here's the most important thing about this meal. The colonists didn't call it Thanksgiving. In Puritan theology, a Thanksgiving was a specific religious observance. You didn't just declare Thanksgiving because you felt grateful. It required a clear sign of God's providence. Rain after a drought, victory in battle, survival from disease. It involved an entire day of prayer and fasting, followed by a communal meal. Ministers would preach for hours about God's mercy and humanity's unworthiness. The first official Thanksgiving in Plymouth didn't happen until July 30th, 1623. That spring, a drought threatened to destroy their crops. The colonists prayed for rain. When it came, Governor Bradford declared a day of Thanksgiving. That's the event that actually established the pattern for future Thanksgivings. Divine intervention, followed by religious observance, followed by feasting. Fast forward to 1827. A widow named Sarah Josepha Hale sits at her desk in New Hampshire, writing by candlelight after her 5 children have gone to bed. Her husband died 5 years ago, leaving her with no income and a family to support. She's turned to the only respectable profession available to widowed women of her social class, writing. But Hale isn't writing just anything. She's crafting a novel called Northwood, A Tale of New England, and in it she's about to invent the modern Thanksgiving dinner. Here's what she wrote. The roasted turkey took precedence on this occasion, being placed at the head of the table, and well did it become its lordly station, sending forth the rich odour of its savoury stuffing, and finely covered with the froth of the basting. At the foot of the board, a sirloin of beef, flanked on either side by a leg of pork and loin of mutton, seemed placed as a bastion to defend the innumerable bowls of gravy and plates of vegetables disposed in that quarter. A goose and pair of ducklings occupied side stations on the table, the middle being graced, as it always is on such occasions, by that rich burgomaster of the provisions, called a chicken pie. Plates of pickles, preserves and butter, and all the necessaries for increasing the seasoning of the viands to the demand of each palate, filled the interstices on the table, leaving hardly sufficient room for the plates of the company, a wine glass and 2 tumblers for each. This description, this exact menu, would become the template for American Thanksgiving dinner, but Hale was just getting started. In 1836, she became the editor of Godey's Lady's Book, the most influential magazine in America. By 1860, it had 150,000 subscribers, massive circulation for that era. Every November issue for 30 years, Hale would publish editorials calling for a national Thanksgiving holiday. She wrote personal letters to 5 different presidents. She published Thanksgiving recipes, Thanksgiving stories, Thanksgiving poems. She single-handedly created the cultural infrastructure for a holiday that didn't yet exist nationally. Why was Hale so obsessed with Thanksgiving? She watched America tearing itself apart over slavery. The 1850s saw Bleeding Kansas, the Fugitive Slave Act, Preston Brooks beating Charles Sumner nearly to death on the Senate floor. Hale believed that national holidays centered on gratitude and domestic harmony could hold the country together. She wrote, "If every state would join in Union Thanksgiving on the same day, would it not be a renewed pledge of love and loyalty to the Constitution?" For 23 years, presidents ignored her. Zachary Taylor didn't respond. Millard Fillmore sent a polite refusal. Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan wouldn't even consider it. Declaring national religious holidays was considered unconstitutional, a violation of the separation between church and state. Then came 1863. Abraham Lincoln is presiding over a country that's literally killing itself. 50,000 men died or were wounded at Gettysburg just 3 months ago. Draft riots have torn through New York City. Lincoln's own son, Willie, died in the White House the year before, sending Mary Lincoln into such deep mourning that she conducted seances trying to contact him. On September 28, 1863, Sarah Hale writes her final letter to a president. We don't have the exact text, but we know she made the same argument she'd been making for decades. Thanksgiving could unify the nation. She probably mentioned that Jefferson Davis had declared Confederate days of Thanksgiving, implying the Union needed to match this. Within a week, Lincoln acts. On October 3, 1863, he issues a proclamation that transforms Hale's dream into reality. But Lincoln doesn't just declare a holiday. He revolutionizes what Thanksgiving means. Lincoln's Thanksgiving proclamation is a masterpiece of political theatre. Remember, this is October 1863. The war that everyone thought would last 3 months has dragged on for 2.5 years. Every family has lost someone. The Union victory at Gettysburg in July has been followed by a bloody stalemate at Chickamauga in September. Nobody knows when or how this war will end. Here's how Lincoln opens his proclamation. The year that is drawing toward its close has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies. To these bounties, which are so constantly enjoyed that we are prone to forget the source from which they come, others have been added, which are of so extraordinary a nature that they cannot fail to penetrate and soften even the heart which is habitually insensible to the ever-watchful providence of Almighty God. Look at what he's doing here. In the middle of the bloodiest war in American history, he's talking about blessings and bounties. He continues, in the midst of a civil war of unequalled magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to foreign states to invite and to provoke their aggression, peace has been preserved with all nations, order has been maintained, the laws have been respected and obeyed, and harmony has prevailed everywhere except in the theatre of military conflict. This is remarkable. Lincoln is essentially saying, yes, we're killing each other, but look, we're not at war with Europe. The courts still function. Most of the country isn't actually a battlefield. It's the political equivalent of finding light in absolute darkness. But here's the genius part. Lincoln makes Thanksgiving explicitly inclusive. He invites my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, and also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands to observe the holiday. Every part of the United States, that includes the South, even though they're in active rebellion. Those at sea, that's the Navy blockading southern ports. Foreign lands, Americans abroad, maybe even Confederate agents in Europe. He asks Americans to gather in their customary places of worship and offer prayers in forms approved by their own consciences. Not in churches, not with Christian prayers, their customary places, their own consciences. Jews, Catholics, Quakers, even the non-religious, everyone's included. Lincoln sets the date as the last Thursday in November, making it official. And here's what he doesn't do. He doesn't mention the Pilgrims. Not once. He doesn't talk about Plymouth or Massachusetts or 1621. For Lincoln, Thanksgiving isn't about the past. It's about holding the present together and imagining a unified future. The response was immediate. Northern newspapers praised it. Churches organised special services. Even some Southern sympathisers admitted it was a brilliant move. Sarah Hale finally had her holiday, though it wasn't quite what she'd imagined. She'd wanted a holiday about colonial heritage and Christian virtue. Lincoln gave America a holiday about union and survival. So if Lincoln didn't mention the Pilgrims, how did they become the centre of Thanksgiving? That story starts in 1769, when something happened that would reshape American history. Plymouth discovered it was becoming irrelevant. For 150 years, Plymouth descendants had considered themselves the aristocracy of New England. They were the Mayflower families, the first comers, the founders of American civilization. But by 1769, Boston had become the centre of revolutionary fervour. Philadelphia was emerging as the political capital. New York was the commercial hub. Plymouth was just a small coastal town with a declining fishing industry and delusions of grandeur. That's when the Plymouth Old Colony Club started manufacturing history. They created something called Forefathers' Day on December 22nd, celebrating the Pilgrims' landing. They invented traditions, special dinners, commemorative speeches, pilgrim costume parades. They erected monuments to events that may or may not have happened. Ever heard of Plymouth Rock? The actual rock where the Pilgrims supposedly first stepped onto American soil? It was identified in 1741 by Thomas Faunce, a 94-year-old man who claimed his father had pointed it out to him. His father hadn't been on the Mayflower. He arrived 3 years later. There's zero contemporary evidence the Pilgrims landed at that specific rock, or cared about it if they did. But Plymouth needed tourist attractions, so Plymouth Rock became sacred. By the 1820s, Plymouth was in full myth-making mode. That's when they started connecting the 1621 harvest feast to their modern Thanksgivings. See, New Englanders had been celebrating Thanksgiving in late November for almost 200 years, complete with turkey dinners and family gatherings. When they read Edward Winslow's brief account of the 1621 feast, they thought, "This sounds like our Thanksgiving. This must be the first one." It wasn't, but that didn't matter. By the 1830s, Plymouth boosters were calling the 1621 event the first Thanksgiving. They commissioned paintings showing pilgrims and Indians dining together in harmony. Never mind that no eyewitness described such a scene. Never mind that the Wampanoag warriors probably ate separately from the colonists. Never mind that Thanksgiving meant something completely different to 17th century Puritans. The myth reached its final form in 1841 when Alexander Young published Chronicles of the Pilgrim Fathers. In a footnote, to Winslow's letter, Young wrote, "This was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England." One historian's casual speculation became accepted fact. But why did this myth spread so successfully? Because America needed it. By the 1850s, millions of Irish and German immigrants were flooding into American cities. Anglo-Americans felt their cultural dominance threatened. The Pilgrim myth provided the origin story that placed English Protestants at the centre of American identity. If the Pilgrims were the fathers of America, then their descendants were the rightful inheritors of American power. The Civil War supercharged this myth-making. After Lincoln's assassination, Thanksgiving became a way to honour his memory. The Pilgrim story got attached to Lincoln's holiday, even though he'd never mentioned them. By the 1870s, school textbooks were teaching the Pilgrim Thanksgiving as historical fact. By 1900, it was as unquestioned as the 4th of July. While the Pilgrim myth was solidifying, something equally artificial was happening to Thanksgiving dinner. Remember Sarah Hale's 1827 novel with its elaborate feast? That menu, turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, was pure fiction when she wrote it. Most Americans had never eaten that combination of foods. But through the power of Godey's Lady's Book, Hale made her fiction into reality. Every November, Hale published Thanksgiving recipes: turkey stuffed with breadcrumbs and sage, cranberry sauce sweetened with sugar, pumpkin pie with a cream filling, mashed potatoes with butter, sweet potatoes with marshmallows. None of these dishes existed at the 1621 feast. Most didn't exist anywhere in America before Hale popularized them. Take cranberry sauce. Native Americans ate cranberries, but they didn't make sauce. They dried them or ate them raw. The colonists found cranberries too tart to eat without sugar, and sugar was impossibly expensive in 1621. Cranberry sauce as we know it didn't appear until the 1790s when sugar became affordable. Hale's magazine taught American women how to make it, establishing it as essential to Thanksgiving, or consider pumpkin pie. Here's where the story gets weird. Pumpkins originated in Central America, cultivated by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. Spanish conquistadors brought pumpkin seeds to Europe in the 1500s. The English developed a tradition of making pumpkin pies. They called them pumpkin pies. When English colonists came to America, they already knew about pumpkin pie from England. But the Plymouth colonists couldn't make pie. They had no ovens. Instead, they hollowed out pumpkins, filled them with milk, honey and spices, and roasted them in coals. The custard would set, and they'd cut the pumpkin into wedges. It wasn't until the 1700s, when brick ovens became common, that Americans could make actual pumpkin pies with crusts. The modern pumpkin pie, with its specific spice blend of cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger and cloves, was standardized by Hale's recipes in Godey's Lady's Book. She literally taught America how to make the dessert that would become synonymous with Thanksgiving. By 1870, the Thanksgiving menu was set. Turkey, stuffing, gravy, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce and pumpkin pie. Variations existed. Southerners added corn pudding, New Englanders insisted on succotash, Midwesterners brought green bean casserole in the 1950s, but the core menu came from Sarah Hale's imagination, not Pilgrim tradition. By the 20th century, Thanksgiving seemed like an immutable tradition. The last Thursday in November, the Pilgrim story, the standard menu, all of it felt ancient and sacred. Then Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to mess with it. In 1939, November had 5 Thursdays, putting Thanksgiving on November 30th. Retailers panicked. The shopping season between Thanksgiving and Christmas would be shortened by a week. During the Great Depression, with unemployment still above 17%, that missing week could mean economic disaster. Fred Lazarus Jr., head of Federated Department Stores, which owned Macy's and Bloomingdale's, went to the White House. He explained to FDR that moving Thanksgiving up a week could boost retail sales by giving people more shopping time. Roosevelt, always willing to try anything to help the economy, agreed. On August 14, 1939, Roosevelt announced that Thanksgiving would be celebrated on November 23rd, the 4th Thursday, rather than November 30th, the last Thursday. The reaction was immediate and furious. Republicans called it Franksgiving and accused Roosevelt of dictatorship. Next he'll abolish winter, one critic sneered. 23 states refused to change their celebrations. 16 states went along with FDR. 3 states, Colorado, Mississippi and Texas, decided to celebrate both days, giving everyone 2 Thanksgivings. The chaos was extraordinary. Football teams had scheduled their big games for November 30th. Calendars were already printed. Families didn't know when to gather. In 1940, with the country still divided, Roosevelt stuck to his guns, again declaring Thanksgiving on the 4th Thursday. By 1941, with America about to enter World War II, Congress decided enough was enough. They passed a joint resolution officially establishing Thanksgiving as the 4th Thursday in November, not the last Thursday, the 4th. This meant Thanksgiving would never fall on November 30th, satisfying retailers, but it would also maintain the traditional late November timing. Roosevelt signed the resolution on December 26, 1941, just 19 days after Pearl Harbor. In the midst of America entering a world war, Congress took time to officially settle the Thanksgiving date controversy. That's how seriously Americans took their Turkey Day. While America was fighting over which Thursday to eat turkey, the Wampanoag were fighting for survival. By 1970, their population had dwindled to fewer than 3,000 people. They owned just 320 acres of land, a fraction of their original territory. Centuries of disease, war, and systematic dispossession had nearly destroyed them. That year, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts planned a huge celebration for the 350th anniversary of the Mayflower landing. They invited Frank James, a Wampanoag leader, to speak at the ceremony. When state officials reviewed his planned speech and saw that it discussed the genocide of native peoples, they asked him to write something more appropriate. James refused. Instead, on Thanksgiving Day 1970, he led a group of Native Americans to Coles Hill overlooking Plymouth Rock. There, he delivered the speech Massachusetts didn't want to hear. The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod for 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn and beans. Massasoit, the great leader of the Wampanoag, knew these facts, yet he and his people welcomed and befriended the settlers, little knowing that before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people. This became the first national day of mourning. Every Thanksgiving since, Native Americans have gathered at Coles Hill to remember their ancestors and protest the mythology that erases their history. The plaque they erected reads, "Thanksgiving Day is a reminder of the genocide of millions of native people, the theft of native lands, and the relentless assault on native culture." The modern Wampanoag perspective completely inverts the Thanksgiving myth. Where American culture sees peaceful cooperation, they see calculated survival. Where the story tells of mutual aid, they see the beginning of dispossession. Where tradition celebrates abundance, they mourn enormous loss. Think about what the Wampanoag actually did in 1621. A people who just lost 2/3 of their population to plague made a military alliance with 103 desperate colonists. They taught these colonists to survive, provided the majority of the food for that famous feast, and maintained the alliance even as more ships brought more colonists. Within a generation, those colonists' children would wage war against the Wampanoag. King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, killed thousands of Native Americans. Survivors were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The Wampanoag lost their political autonomy and most of their land. By the time Lincoln declared Thanksgiving a national holiday, the tribe that had saved Plymouth was nearly extinct. While Native Americans mourned, American businesses were turning Thanksgiving into the engine of consumer capitalism. The transformation started with Macy's. On Thanksgiving Day 1924, Macy's employees dressed as clowns, cowboys and knights, marching from 145th Street to the flagship store at 34th Street. Live animals from the Central Park Zoo, elephants, camels, donkeys, paraded down Manhattan. At the end, Santa Claus was crowned King of the Kiddies on Macy's balcony, officially opening the Christmas shopping season. The parade was supposedly for children, but the real audience was their parents. By positioning itself as the official start of Christmas shopping, Macy's made itself synonymous with holiday retail. The parade grew each year, adding the giant balloons in 1927, starting with Felix the Cat. By the 1930s, over 1 million people lined the streets to watch. Television changed everything. NBC began broadcasting the parade in 1948, bringing it into homes across America. By the 1960s, watching the Macy's parade was as traditional as eating turkey. The parade became a 3-hour commercial for Christmas shopping disguised as family entertainment. Other retailers couldn't let Macy's dominate. Gimbel started its own parade in Philadelphia. Hudson's created one in Detroit. But Macy's had won the national stage. Today, 50 million Americans watch the parade on television, making it one of the most watched annual events in America. The parade established the pattern, but Black Friday perfected it. The term originally described the traffic chaos in Philadelphia as shoppers flooded downtown the day after Thanksgiving. Retailers hated the name. It sounded negative. They tried renaming it Big Friday in the 1960s, but it didn't stick. By the 1980s, retailers had rebranded the meaning. Black Friday now meant the day retailers went from being in the red, losing money, to in the black, profitable. This was mostly fiction. Successful retailers didn't depend on one day to become profitable, but it created urgency. If stores needed Black Friday to survive, shoppers had a patriotic duty to shop. The 2000s brought a new level of intensity. Stores began opening earlier, first 6 a.m., then 4 a.m., then midnight. By 2011, major retailers were opening at 8 p.m. on Thanksgiving itself. Workers had to leave their family dinners to sell televisions. Shoppers abandoned their tables to camp outside Best Buy. The backlash was inevitable. Workers protested, petitions circulated. Some states tried passing laws keeping stores closed on Thanksgiving. The rhetoric was revealing. People spoke of saving Thanksgiving and protecting family time as if Thanksgiving was under assault from commercial forces. Nobody mentioned that Thanksgiving itself was a commercial creation, invented by a magazine editor and promoted by department stores. So let's strip away all the mythology and ask, what actually happened in autumn 1621. A group of English religious separatists half dead from scurvy and starvation managed to bring in their first successful harvest with extensive help from the Wampanoag. They held a 3-day feast that was partly celebration, partly military exercise. Their Wampanoag allies, responding to what they thought was an attack, arrived with 90 warriors and ended up staying for diplomatic reasons, contributing the majority of the food. The two groups maintained an uneasy alliance born of mutual desperation. The colonists needed the Wampanoag's agricultural knowledge and protection, while the Wampanoag needed allies against the Narragansett. Within that person, Tisquantum's lifetime, this alliance would collapse into brutal war. Nothing about this event was called Thanksgiving. Nothing about it was particularly harmonious. Nothing about it represented the founding of America or the cooperation between cultures. It was a minor diplomatic gathering that nobody remembered as significant until 200 years later, when Plymouth needed tourist revenue. The real history of Thanksgiving is the history of its invention. Sarah Hale creating a national holiday through sheer force of will, Lincoln weaponizing gratitude to hold together a fragmenting nation, Plymouth mythmakers fabricating an origin story, Macy's turning a religious observance into a shopping advertisement. Every element we consider traditional was deliberately constructed. The date? Negotiated by Congress in 1941. The menu? Standardized by a 19th century women's magazine. The Pilgrim story? Fabricated by 1830s tourism promoters. The parade? A department store marketing scheme. Here's what's remarkable about Thanksgiving. Even knowing it's all manufactured, it still works. Families still gather. People still reflect on gratitude. The food still tastes good. The fact that it's artificial doesn't make it meaningless. But we should be honest about what we're celebrating. Not the Pilgrims and Indians coming together. That's mythology. Not ancient tradition. It's barely 160 years old as a national holiday. Not cultural unity. Indigenous people observe it as a day of mourning. What we're actually celebrating is an idea Sarah Josepha Hale had during a depression, that Abraham Lincoln amplified during a war that survived being moved by FDR, commercialized by Macy's, and challenged by native voices. It's a holiday that exists because enough people decided it should exist and fought to make it real. The Wampanoag leader Frank James ended his 1970 speech with these words, "Our spirit refuses to die. We still walk the lands of our fathers, and we shall live in the ways of our fathers as we were meant to in this land." That's perhaps the most honest thing anyone's said about Thanksgiving. Despite the mythology, despite the commercialization, despite everything, we're all still here, telling our own versions of the story, claiming our own meanings from this manufactured tradition. The feast happened. The gratitude is real. Everything else? That's just gravy.